Now, the topic of my message this morning is growing through suffering. Great topic to talk about. Our goal in 2021 is to see each and every one of us grow, to see measurable growth in our lives throughout the year. Now, growth, as we've seen over the last few months, is our adaptive response to stress. When you're under stress, we adapt to cope with the stress by becoming stronger, whether that's physical stress, mental stress, emotional stress, or spiritual stress. Unfortunately, stress always involves a certain level of pain and suffering, and often we don't get to choose when or where that stress enters our world. Now, too much stress, though, can cause trauma to our bodies and our souls, and the ongoing suffering that causes can steal our joy and take away any hope that we might have for a better future. What does the Bible have to say that can help us navigate the rugged, lava-filled valleys that life so often wants to throw us in when we feel least ready to cope with them? Firstly, before we get into my message, I just want to say as clearly as possible that there is hope. If you are struggling with a lot of pain at the moment, there is hope. There is light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not a train. Psalm 126, verse 5 to 6 says, Those who plant in tears will harvest with shouts of joy. They weep as they go to plant their seed, but they sing as they return with the harvest. We have a wonderful picture here of tears being turned into shouts of joy. The costly seeds that we initially planted have produced a harvest that is far larger than the original precious seed that was sown. The question that I ask when I read this particular psalm is, what would have happened if they had eaten the seed and not planted it? Now, they might have held off tears for a day, but there would have been plenty more in their future when starvation hit. The point here is that you can't avoid pain and suffering. You can't avoid it if you are a human living on planet Earth. However, you can definitely manage it better by the things that you do and the way that you process it. Now, trauma has been a near constant topic in the media over this past 12 months, and for a very good reason. We've experienced a worldwide pandemic, and the fallout has impacted on our ability to live our lives the way we were able to in the past. Here in Tassie, we've been extremely fortunate and haven't suffered in the same way that other parts of the globe have, but it's still been difficult. Economic hardship, relational breakdown, attacks on free speech, and a rise in militant politics, along with a media-induced fatigue, heightened expectations on families and parents, a comparison culture driven by a social media experiment that's taking place in real time, all add up to create an underlying sense of pain and ongoing suffering in many people's lives that they feel powerless to escape from. In the mid-90s, the psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun developed a concept called post-traumatic growth. Now, the basic idea is that some people seem to grow as a result of trauma. They come out of the other side of a painful experience not just okay, but better, stronger, deeper. As Tedeschi put it, people develop new understandings of themselves, the world they live in, how to relate to other people, the kind of future they might have, and a better understanding of how to live. Now, Tedeschi and Calhoun went on to create the post-traumatic growth inventory, which was an attempt to measure pain's effect on growth in 5 different areas: appreciation of life, relationship with others, new possibilities in life, personal strength, and spiritual change. Now, in a time of pain or suffering, you can experience growth and expansion in all of these areas if you survive. Now, there's no doubt that the last 10 years have been filled with all sorts of challenges across our world, Much of the world is in turmoil, and everywhere you look, people are hurting. Now, unfortunately, suffering doesn't always bring out the best in people at the time. And in these past few years, we've seen the rise of what's been labelled the intolerance of the tolerant, which has caused extra hurt on top of the normal pain that life can send our way. In a previous time of social upheaval, the African American story writer James Baldwin had this insight. He said, I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. Behind the proliferation of hate, behind the fever pitch of outrage culture, behind the ranting and raving on social media between one tribe against another, is a world in acute emotional pain. Psychologists will tell you that you need to distinguish between pain and suffering because they're not synonymous. Pain is what is. A global pandemic, the loss of a business, the death of a loved one, the constant arguing that goes on at home. Whereas suffering is our response to what is. It's the meaning we make or don't make of our pain. It's our emotional reaction. It's our body's way of first holding and then finding a healthy or toxic way to discharge the pain. And for a lot of people, the result of suffering is trauma, a kind of deep emotional wound that we carry in our bodies, a toxic memory that lives on in our body's subconscious, sabotaging our best efforts to move forward into relational wholeness. And we probably all know someone who is obviously hurting really badly, and because of that pain, because of that hurt, are terrible in their personal relationships. The pain and suffering that you experience in your life literally has a potential to make or break you, to produce ongoing trauma or post-traumatic growth. Much of it has to do with our response and the quality of our relationships. So, how do we make sure that we fall on the side of post-traumatic growth? To find an answer, we're going to hear from the writer James, who was Jesus' brother, and one of the many figures in the New Testament who was very familiar with pain and suffering. James's words come to us from a place of both personal experience and spiritual authority. James was a leader in the church, the fledgling church in Jerusalem, and he also had personal experience of suffering and persecution. The opening statement of his letter reads as follows: James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, greetings. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Now, most scholars date James's letter to around about 65 AD, right after a wave of persecution scattered the church all over the Mediterranean. The gospel that God had made the crucified Jesus both Lord and Messiah was a threat to the power brokers from Rome and the corrupt Jewish leadership of the time. They reacted with violence against the church. Followers of Jesus faced a bitter decision: run from the government crackdown, or be thrown into jail and possibly lose their lives. In fact, the word scattered used by James in verse 1 is diaspora in the Greek. The same word is used in Acts 8. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Now, thankfully in the West, we aren't facing persecution in the true sense of the word. It's still legal for us to gather together to worship Jesus in public, at least for now. James is writing to a church that is facing trials of many kinds. Not just one trial, but multiple, with a compounding effect. And he's writing to a church that is most likely, if you read between the lines, struggling to stay positive. And some of you might feel that that's where you are right now. You're not just struggling with one trial, but you seem to have trials coming at you from every single direction. And they're having a compounding effect on your life, and you're struggling to be positive. Now, James's opening statement is full of wisdom that's worth our time and attention. I want to just tease it out line by line this morning. The first word, consider. In Greek, it's hagame. It can also be translated count. So, consider it all joy, count it all joy. It means to do the math. Now, if you're not a maths person like me, this is going to be a bit challenging, right? But it says, do the math, add up the facts, calculate the sum total. The idea that James is getting across here is this: run a mathematical calculation on your trials, sort the data into a loss column and a profit column. Now, if you value what God values, you will realize that the result of trials is often a net profit. We gain more than we lose. In times of loss, it's easy to forget how much is in the gain column. Namely, the growth of a deeper, wider, and stronger soul. A character that will last past this life and into the life to come. Trials have the potential to give far more than they take away, but the price you pay is pain and potentially long-term suffering. Now, James is saying here, do the mental spreadsheet. There's more profit than loss. Therefore, he says, the logical emotion to that conclusion is joy. He's not saying that we're to have joy in spite of our trials, but because of them. More specifically, because of what they're doing in us. Now, at this point in time, I'm still not convinced, all right? So let's keep going. Consider it pure joy. Pure joy, not mixed, not 1 part joy, 3 part sadness, but pure joy. Now, the joy that James is getting at here is a far cry from the Australian pursuit of happiness, or happenstance, which is happy feelings based on circumstances. It's a joy that, whilst not above or unaffected by our circumstances, goes beyond them. It doesn't require our external world to be in order or okay in order for our internal world to be okay. It's a joy that can only come from one source: our relationship with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who have always experienced joy in their relationship with each other even from before anything that was created was created. It's the joy that Jesus talked about when he said, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Charlie Dates, in a sermon on James 1, made this claim. He said, God has a corresponding joy for every trial we find ourselves in. This joy that we have, the world didn't give it to us, and the world can't take it away. Circumstances didn't give us this joy, so circumstances can't take it away. God has a joy that defies our trials. In a similar upbeat tone, Bono once called joy an act of defiance. Joy is a rebellion against Satan, sin, and death, a resistance against the gravitational pull of hatred, despair, and hopelessness. And when does James want us to apply this act of defiance? Whenever you face trials of many kinds. Note that it's when we face trials, not if. Trials will come. Now, Thomas says, based on his years as a therapist serving those in deep pain, wrote this. He said, the simplest, the most ancient of human truths, namely that life is an arduous and tragic struggle, that what we call sanity has a great deal to do with competence, earned by struggling for excellence, with compassion, hard won by confronting conflict, and with modesty and patience acquired through silence and suffering. That's a difficult one to get your head around. Job, though, the poster child of suffering in the Old Testament, was much more concise, and he said, man is born to trouble as sparks fly upward. Yeah. Or in the words of Jesus himself, in this world you will have trouble. In a world still suffering, Under the weight of human and demonic sin, trouble is the rule, whilst ease is the exception to the rule. Now, that might sound a little bit harsh, but acceptance of the fact that life is hard is not only the path to wisdom, but to joy. As M. Scott Peck writes on the opening page of The Road Less Travelled, when you expect life to be easy, it's very hard, but when you expect it to be hard in an ironic twist, it's very good. All right, next phrase. Whenever you face trials of many kinds, the word face here can also be translated fall into or trip over. It's a word picture. Imagine you're walking along and everything's sunny. It's not like today, but everything's sunny. And you're just minding your own business, and all of a sudden you trip over a crack in the pavement. One minute you're humming along with the birds, and the next you're falling through the air and rethinking your health insurance plan. One Greek lexicon defines it as to experience somewhat suddenly that which is difficult or bad. The past year that we've experienced together corporately is a great example. Who here predicted a global pandemic that would start halfway through my long service leave? I had no idea. If we knew that was happening, we wouldn't have booked all the airfares and the accommodation that we did that we never got back. Trials. The word for trials in James is parasmos. It can be translated as trial or test or temptation, but it's also the Greek word for a disaster, or wait for it, plague. Now, notice the end of the phrase, trials of many kinds. Now, the word many literally means multicoloured. Other translations have various kinds, major, minor, political, personal, economic, emotional. The word refers to the various trials made up that make up life this side of Eden. From a car breaking down, to waking up in the morning with a kink in your neck, to the tragic death of a friend or a family member, to a vicious disease or a violent mob protesting in the middle of the city, and everything in between. Now, think about what James is saying. Whenever we stumble and fall into various kinds of trials that are not in our 5-year plan, trials that we hate and which cause us deep pain, he says, consider it pure joy. Why in the world would I do that? And James anticipates our question and he answers it in verse 3. Because you know. Now the word know is ginosko. It's not head knowledge, but personal experience knowledge. The way you know your spouse or best friend or know a restaurant you love or know God. If you follow Jesus for any length of time, you come to know that the testing, the word testing here means to try to learn the genuineness of something by examination and testing, often through actual use. It's not referring to the kind of test you take in high school or at college where you get the right or wrong answer. It's close to the way car makers test a new SUV or off-road vehicle before they release it to the public. The engineers and the marketers make all these wonderful claims about the vehicle, but that it can go so far, it can handle this type of terrain, it can take this type of pressure. But then they give it to a test driver and a film crew who take it out bush and they just beat it to death. And they run it through sand and the mud, over rocks, through rivers. They smash it around and they push it to the limit and beyond. Why? To test. Does it actually have the capacity to do what its maker says it has the capacity to do? Or is it all just simply hype and digital spin? What a field test is to an off-road vehicle, trials are to disciples of Jesus. They're a test. But what are they testing? They are testing your faith. Now the word faith here is pistis, and a lot of English speakers confuse the word faith with the word belief. They don't realise that pistis can either be translated faith or faithfulness. Some argue a better English translation is the word allegiance. So belief has to do with your level of trust in and reliance on God. Faith has to do with how long you can hold to that trust and reliance on God through trials, through seasons of pain and suffering. When you feel that God has abandoned you, or the cost of allegiance is too great to bear. Faith in God is faithfulness to God, no matter what comes, no matter the cost. That's what's being put to the test right now, our pistis. Do we trust Jesus enough to stay faithful to him, to his way, to what the Bible says, to his church through 2021 and beyond? Or will we quit and give up? Now, this is this is where we're getting to the good part. The testing of your faith produces perseverance. Now, the word perseverance is hypomone in the Greek, and depending on what translation of the Bible you read, it can be translated as perseverance or endurance or steadfastness. One lexicon defines it as the capacity to continue to bear up under difficult circumstances. Hypomone is a kind of emotional resilience, an inner strength of will, a capacity to live and love when the wind of circumstances is against you, to continue under pressure. But it's not just a grinding it out for Jesus with a permanent scowl etched on your face. It also comes with a buoyancy of hope. Now, we think of hope as being about the future, and it is, but it's for the present. Hope is for the present. I define hope as the expectation of things coming good based on the person and promises of God. Hope is a kind of emotional energy to live well in the present in light of what's coming in the future. That's what trials have the potential to produce in us, a hopeful energy to keep going when life is hard. Making sense?
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, good.
James ends his intro, and this whole thing is just his opening statement of his letter, with a strong exhortation for those currently in a season of trouble. He says, let perseverance finish its work. And I love Eugene Peterson's Message translation. It says, don't try to get out of anything prematurely, as in before you mature. Verse 4, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. There's a play on words here in the Greek that we miss in the English translation. The word finish, let these trials, let the suffering you're going through finish its work. This perseverance finish its work. The word finish is the verb form, and the word mature is the noun form of the same Greek word telos. So more literally, it's let perseverance mature you so that you become mature. Perseverance through trouble has the potential to develop in us a rich blend of emotional maturity and spiritual life, to the point where love, peace, and the inner life of joy and the inner life of Jesus becomes our true nature, where we actually become godly or godlike. Now, when the ancients used the word theosis in the Greek, or deification in translating it into English, what they meant was that the end goal of discipleship is becoming like the God we love. Now, the word complete is a Greek word meaning whole. Hence the next line, another play on words, not lacking anything. The idea is that prior to our various trials, we were deficient in something, but our pain and suffering has not subtracted as much as it's added to us. Now we are whole, well developed and mature. Now notice the link between perseverance and maturity. We don't think our way into maturity or even feel our way into maturity. We persevere our way into maturity. Maturity isn't the result of reading a lot of books, sitting in a lot of classrooms, or listening to a lot of podcasts. Maturity is the result of a long obedience in the same direction. It's a cumulative effect of a lifetime of prayer and surrender to God as we persevere through various trials. But here's the promise. The lifelong journey doesn't have to be an emotional grind. We can persevere with joy. But of course, that's not the norm. Take an emotional poll of your friend group. Very few people are happy about the onslaught of a global pandemic, except maybe for those who have shares in Zoom. What cause of joy do we have that the rest of the world doesn't? Now, I have three, but we don't have time to get through all three, but we are going to look at the first one, because I think this one is going to do something in your heart this morning. And it's not going to sound really great when I tell you what it is, but as I explain it, I think you're going to... I'm praying, I'm believing that you will see something you've never seen before, and that it will change something on the inside of you. So, the first one of the three, well, the only one that you're going to hear today, is this. This is why we can have joy. We are not alone. We're a part of the family of God. Oh, yeah? What does that mean? I'm glad you asked. Now, in the line-by-line exegesis of the text that we just started with, I skipped over one very important word in verse 2, and it's the word adelphoi, which is translated as brothers and sisters. The full line is, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." Who is to consider it pure joy? We are, because we're family in it together. Even the word you is plural in the Greek. Now think about the implications of a plural experience of suffering versus a singular one. This past year has been traumatic for so many, but it could have been far, far worse. Because psychologists tell us trauma is what happens when people experience suffering alone. We've had a worldwide pandemic, but we've all gone through it together. The therapist, Robert Stollerow, has this insightful definition of trauma. He said, "Trauma is when severe emotional pain cannot find a relational home in which it can be held." You're probably thinking, okay, what does that mean? I'm going to explain it. Trauma is not just about the level of intensity in suffering, i.e. when people experience suffering that's above and beyond the normal aches and pains of life. Many people live through extraordinary pain, a global pandemic, the unexpected death of a child or a spouse, the gruesome death of a fellow soldier on the battlefield, and come out the other side healthy and strong. Trauma is also about the level of isolation that we experience it in. When we experience suffering, we need a relational home. In Stollerow's language, we need a relationship where we feel safe to open up, to let our soul bleed in front of someone else. We need another soul to hold our pain in compassion. Now, many years ago, the social psychologist James Pennebaker, he conducted the first large-scale study of trauma survivors, and his goal was to determine why some people experience suffering and are devastated, whilst others experience the same thing, but seem to not only come through it, but on the other side are often more joyful and at ease than they were before. Pennebaker's hypothesis was that trauma for which there is a social stigma is harder to recover from than any other forms of trauma. For example, he and his team researched sexual assault and the suicide of a spouse. Two forms of trauma where they anticipated people would feel shame. But they discovered their hypothesis was completely wrong. There was zero correlation between the nature of the trauma and the potential for recovery. That's interesting. It turned out that the number one factor in recovery was whether or not the person had family or a friend or some kind of an emotional support group to talk about and process the pain with. What people need is a relational home. Those who had one were mostly spared any long-term negative effects. Now, if I'm reading Jesus, and the New Testament authors correctly, they are calling us as followers of Jesus to be that relational home to each other. They envision the church as a family. Not a perfect community by any means, because let's face it, all families are dysfunctional. It's just a matter of degree. But one where we suffer through the world of sin together, where we come together and hold each other's pain in love. Now, this has been a struggle for the church ever since it came into existence on the day of Pentecost. You read through the New Testament. Most of the one another commands, love one another, bear with one another, forgive one another, all assume relational brokenness, not health. Read Paul's letter to the Galatians or Corinthians, and yet Jesus and Paul and all the New Testament authors continue to call the church to live into her identity as brothers and sisters, and their emphasis is not what the church should be, but what we should be. So when the church lets us down, as it can do, the invitation is not to disengage and write it off, but re-engage with greater commitment. We must be for others what we desire them to be for us. A relational home. If I could have the musos back, that'd be great. So my final point here, before we have a time of ministry, is this. The essential fact of discipleship is that we can't follow Jesus alone. Jesus designed the church as our relational home, where we can persevere through pain and suffering with our siblings in the family of God. And the question is, who are you providing a relational home for? That's a good question to be asking yourself. But I wonder today, how many people are sitting here and they know they've got a lot of pain stored up on the inside, but they've never been able to share it. They've never been able to get it out. Some of you men have got way too much anger, or you're expressing way too much anger because you are really sad on the inside and you've never been able to share that with anybody. And the more we lock pain up on the inside without sharing it, without getting it out, the more it affects our behaviour and the way we relate to others. And it's one of those dichotomies in life. It's like the people that need others the most are so often the ones that push people away the most, because there is unresolved pain on the inside and they've never found a relational home where they can feel safe, where they can sit with someone else and they can share what they're going through. And listen, you don't have to have answers when people are sharing. The reality of it is, there are no answers to a lot of the suffering that people go through. They just got to get through it. You can't change it, they're going to go through it. They've got to get to the other end. But what you can provide for them is a safe place to share. And it's in the sharing that something starts to happen to that pain. It becomes manageable. Ladies, I just said to the guys, guys have got issues with holding stuff in, but ladies, you have too. And we often say that ladies are luckier than men because they tend to be more relational, they'll share. But ladies, I wonder if there are things that you've been holding in that you've never shared, that are affecting the way you feel about the future, that are affecting the way you relate to others around you. And the great vision that Jesus has for his church is that we would be to each other their relational home. Their relational home. It's not about running services. What services do is they give us a reason to gather together and to start this journey of relationship with each other. But we've got to go further than that. Now you don't have to be friends with everybody, right? You don't have to go sharing. Some people, you may have met some people like this. They're kind of like oversharers. They share with everybody. And even that's not bad. That's just the way they're expressing their pain. But listen, you don't have to have lots and lots of people, but you need to have at least one. You need to get it out. Now, what if you don't know someone who you feel safe to go and share with? Does that mean that you are stuck in this cycle of pain for the rest of your life? I want to tell you, there is someone that you can go and share with, and he'll always hold your pain for you, and he'll help you process it. But it's a little bit more difficult because you can't see him. That's Jesus. He said to the people one day when he was teaching them, he said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." Who is he talking to? He's talking to people who are carrying a lot of pain. He's talking to people who are struggling, who are suffering. And he said to them, "Come to me, come to me, I'll give you rest." Peter says, "Cast your cares upon him because he cares for you. Take your pain and cast it on him. Let him be your relational home." If there's nobody else that you can trust, if there's nobody else in your world, it doesn't mean that you're hopeless. It doesn't mean that there's no hope. Take your pain and cast it on him.